the moment that changed everything. It had been one of those evenings in Los Angeles when the sky looked like it was painted carefully by someone who understood the softness of light and the calmness of fading days. The kind of sky that made people pause for just a second even if they had spent their whole lives in the same city. Sandra Bullock stood in the parking area behind the small private studio where she and Keanu Reeves had just finished filming a charity segment for a children's foundation. And although the event had ended smoothly, there was something off in the way she lingered, quietly, almost as if she wanted to disappear into the silence before anyone noticed she was still there. She had smiled throughout the entire event, charming the audience, greeting the kids with a warmth that only she could express. But the moment it was over, the moment the cameras dimmed and the last handshake was completed, her shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly, her breath slowed, and her eyes, usually so bright with quiet humor and resilience, seemed to hide something she had been carrying for far too long. Keanu, who had walked out a few feet ahead of her, paused instinctively before he reached his motorcycle, sensing that something wasn't right, as if the air behind him suddenly felt heavier, something he could not ignore. He turned and watched her for a few seconds, noticing how she held her bag closer to her body, how she kept adjusting the strap even though it didn't need adjusting, and in those small gestures he recognized that the mask she wore for the world was slipping, even if she didn't realize it. Keanu took a slow breath, debating whether to call out her name or walk towards her, and then in the most natural instinct of his gentle nature he began walking back to her. She noticed him approaching and quickly put on a polite smile, one of those smiles people wear when they don't want anyone to ask questions. But Keanu had known her for decades, knew when she was hiding pain behind her laughter, knew when her voice carried a tremor even if no one else could hear it. "Sandy, you okay?" He asked gently, his tone soft enough to show concern without overwhelming her. Sandra shook her head, brushing back a strand of hair that the breeze had pushed across her face and tried to laugh it off, saying she was just tired, that the day had been long and she needed to get home to rest. But Keanu didn't move, didn't step back, didn't give her the space she thought she wanted. Instead, he looked at her with those kind, steady eyes that had comforted her through heartbreak, through career struggles, and through the many emotional storms she had hidden from the tabloids and the world. "You've been quiet today," he said, "more than usual." At that, Sandra failed to hold the smile, and her eyes flickered away from him, as if she was trying to stop something inside her from rising to the surface. Before Keanu could ask more, Sandra mumbled a soft goodbye and began walking toward her car. But then something happened, something so small, yet so telling, that made Keanu's concern turn into urgency. Sandra reached for her car door, but her hand trembled slightly, not enough for a stranger to notice, but Keanu saw it. She blinked rapidly as if trying to stop tears before they could escape. She inhaled sharply, the way people inhale when they are trying to hold themselves together, and Keanu knew in that instant that she was okay, not even close. Without thinking twice, he jogged toward her, calling her name, and when she didn't turn, he quickened his pace until he reached her just as she opened the driver's door. She paused, keeping her head lowered as if ashamed to be seen in this vulnerable state, but Keanu gently placed his hand on the edge of the door to stop her from closing herself off. "Sandy," he said softly, "please look at me." It took her several seconds before she lifted her eyes, and when she did, Keanu felt something inside him twist painfully, because he saw a depth of hurt that she had hidden so masterfully that even he hadn't noticed it fully until now. It wasn't the kind of hurt caused by exhaustion or disappointment. It was the kind that came from carrying a heavy truth for far too long, one that ate away at someone slowly, quietly, secretly. "You don't have to tell me," he whispered, "but don't drive like this. Just let me stay with you for a moment." Sandra swallowed hard, her throat tightening around the words she seemed to be struggling to speak. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed, and said something almost inaudible, that she was fine, that she didn't want to burden him, that everyone had problems and she wasn't special. Keanu shook his head, his expression soft but firm. "You're not a burden, you never have been. And whatever's happening, you're not alone, not tonight." Those last two words, "not tonight," hit something inside her because tonight was different. Tonight was the night she learned something that shattered her sense of safety, something she didn't want anyone to know, especially Keanu. Still, the tears she tried desperately to hide began to gather again, and she blinked rapidly, looking up at the sky as if the fading light could hold her together. But the truth was, she felt more exposed than she had in years. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice unsteady, "if I tell you, everything will change." Keanu took a small step closer, lowering his voice, making sure she felt no pressure, only warmth, only understanding. "Then let it change," he said. "If it's hurting you this much, it shouldn't stay inside you anymore." She let out a shaky breath, and then, without warning, her legs seemed to weaken. Keanu reacted instantly, reaching out and placing his hand gently on her arm to steady her. She didn't collapse, but she leaned slightly toward him, just enough for him to realize how fragile she truly felt at that moment. Sandra whispered, "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know." Keanu felt her trembling under his hand, and without hesitation, he guided her away from the car, leading her toward a nearby bench where she could sit and breathe without trying to hold herself upright. Once she sat down, she covered her face with her hands, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Keanu sat quietly beside her, respecting her silence while staying close enough to show that he wasn't going anywhere. The soft breeze moved around them, carrying the faint sounds of distant traffic and laughter from the people who had left the event earlier, unaware that a moment of emotional truth was unfolding in this quiet corner of the parking lot. Sandra finally lowered her hands and stared ahead, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Keanu, the truth I've been hiding, it didn't start today. It didn't start last week. It's been there for years. And every time we've worked together, every time we've talked, every moment I've seen you being your kind, gentle self, it got harder to keep it inside." Keanu listened intently, not interrupting, not urging her to say more, simply waiting, like a steady anchor in the middle of a storm she had been trying to face alone. She exhaled slowly, her voice trembling with each word. "I thought I was protecting myself. I thought I was protecting you, but now I feel like it's drowning me." Keanu leaned slightly closer, his tone soft but unwavering. "Then tell me, Sandy, whatever it is, let me share the weight." And in that moment, Sandra looked at him, not as a co-star, not as a friend, not as a Hollywood partner, but as someone she had trusted for nearly 3 decades, someone she had leaned on emotionally even when she pretended she didn't need anyone, someone whose quiet presence had always made the world feel less overwhelming. Her lips parted as if she was ready to speak, but the words caught in her throat, and instead of answering, fresh tears escaped her eyes, rolling down her cheeks in silent surrender. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded handkerchief he always carried, and handed it to her gently. She took it with shaking hands, pressing it to her face as she whispered, "I'm scared." He nodded softly. "I know, but you're safe. I'm right here." She closed her eyes, gathering strength from the calmness in his voice, the steady comfort of his presence, and after several long seconds, she finally whispered the beginning of a truth that would change everything between them forever. A truth she had hidden for years, a truth that had shaped her actions, her fears, her choices, and her silence. And Keanu, with every ounce of compassion he had, prepared himself to hear it. The secret she feared would break everything. Sandra sat there with her fingers interlocked tightly, gripping the handkerchief Keanu had given her, and the evening's quietness wrapped around them like a fragile veil that could shatter with even the smallest sound. But she kept breathing unevenly, as if each inhale pulled a weight she had carried for years, and each exhale threatened to reveal the truth she had been hiding for far too long. And Keanu remained beside her, grounded and still, as though he understood that sometimes silence is the only bridge a person has left before they step into the vulnerability they've avoided. She finally lifted her eyes toward the darkening horizon, the warmth of sunset fading into a cooler night, and with a voice that trembled at the edges, she whispered, "Keanu. I've lived with this fear for so long that I started believing it was safer to keep it buried, safer to pretend everything was okay, safer to carry it alone than risk hurting anyone I care about, especially you." Keanu looked at her gently, his expression neither confused nor impatient, but rather filled with the same quiet empathy that had made people around the world believe he was one of the rare souls left in Hollywood who had never lost his humanity in the glare of the spotlight. He angled his body slightly toward her, leaning just enough to tell her through posture and presence that she had his full attention. "Whatever you say," he murmured, "I'm here, and nothing you tell me will push me away." Sandra breathed in deeply, paused, and then released a slow exhale filled with years of unsaid truths, and her voice came out softer than the night breeze when she finally said, "This started back on the set of our first movie together, when everything felt easy, light, safe, when you were the only person in that entire production who saw me as a human being instead of a character or a paycheck or a headline waiting to happen. You treated me like I mattered, and that scared me more than anything." She closed her eyes as if the memories rushed back too vividly and continued, "Because I have always been terrified of depending on someone, of leaning on someone, of letting someone close enough to hurt me." Keanu listened, his heartbeat slow but heavy, because something in her tone told him that her truth was intertwined with something deeper. Something about him, about them, about a bond that had silently lived between them for decades. Sandra opened her eyes again, staring ahead as though trying to stabilize herself before the next wave of emotion. "I didn't understand it back then," she said shakily. "But over the years, every time we worked together, every time we bumped into each other by accident, every time we shared a joke or one of those silent moments where you don't need words to feel understood, it grew, this feeling that frightened me more than I could admit. I thought that if I acknowledged it, it would break everything. Our friendship, our comfort, our trust, our history. I thought it was safer to hide it than risk losing you entirely." Keanu felt his breath hitch just slightly, not enough for her to notice unless she had been staring at him, but she wasn't. She was lost in her confession, in the years she had spent navigating feelings she had convinced herself not to name. She continued, "So I pulled back. Every time things felt too real, I stepped away. Every time you were kind to me, I made myself busy. Every time you showed up for me, I convinced myself it was just who you were with everyone, not something special. I built walls around my heart so tightly that I started believing they were protecting me. But really, they were suffocating me." Keanu's voice came out soft, barely audible but steady enough to show her he was fully present. "Sandy, what exactly have you been hiding from me?" Sandra swallowed hard, gathering her courage piece by piece, and then with tears welling slowly in her eyes, she whispered, "The truth is that I cared about you more than I allowed myself to show. I cared in ways that terrified me." She paused, her breath shaking, before adding, "And I thought that if you knew, you'd pull away, or pity me, or treat me differently. Or worse, you'd feel pressured to respond in a way you didn't want to. I didn't want to ruin what we had." For a moment, Keanu didn't speak. He simply absorbed her words, understanding that this wasn't just about affection or fear. It was about years of emotional self-preservation, about a woman who had given so much to the world that she had forgotten how to receive compassion without bracing for pain. He finally asked, "Sandy, are you saying that the truth you've been hiding is that you felt something for me?" She closed her eyes tightly, nodding once. A small, fragile movement that carried more weight than any dramatic confession could. But then, unexpectedly, Sandra shook her head after that nod, wiping her tears aggressively as if trying to correct herself. "It's not just that," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Keanu, I didn't just care about you, I depended on you emotionally in ways I never admitted. You were my grounding, my comfort, the presence I always felt safe around, even when I wasn't safe with myself. And the truth I hid, the part that terrifies me the most, is that I didn't tell you because something happened years ago that made me believe I didn't deserve people like you in my life." Keanu stiffened slightly at the shift in her tone. "What happened?" he asked gently, afraid of the answer yet determined to hear it. Sandra inhaled sharply, her voice trembling as she said, "I was betrayed by someone I trusted deeply, someone I thought cared about me, someone who used my vulnerability against me. And after that, I promised myself I would never let anyone get close enough to hurt me like that again. So whenever you got close emotionally, even unintentionally, I panicked. I pulled back. I told myself you deserved someone who wasn't broken." Keanu felt something twist painfully in his chest because hearing her call herself broken felt wrong, not just because he never saw her that way, but because she was one of the strongest, most compassionate people he had ever known. "Sandy," he said softly, "you're not broken. You went through something painful, but that doesn't mean you're unworthy of care." She shook her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "For years," she whispered, "I believed that if you ever saw the parts of me that were damaged, you'd step away. I thought you'd see me differently. And yet every time I was near you, every time you looked at me with those calm eyes, every time you treated me with kindness that wasn't performative or forced, the fear inside me grew stronger because I knew I was hiding something you deserved to know." Keanu leaned closer, speaking slowly, making sure every word carried weight. "Sandy, I've never judged you, not once, and nothing you say will ever make me see you any less." She wiped her cheeks again, pressing her fingers firmly against her skin as if trying to stop the emotional flood. "The truth I hid, Keanu, the one that's been eating me alive, is that I needed you. I needed your presence, your kindness, your calmness. And instead of telling you, instead of letting you in, I buried it until it became this weight I couldn't carry anymore." Her voice cracked, her next words barely a whisper. "And today, something happened that made all those feelings rush back so intensely that I couldn't hide them anymore." Keanu's brows furrowed gently. "What happened today?" Sandra trembled, inhaling slowly as she prepared to reveal the moment that had shattered her emotional defenses. "I got a message," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the ground. "A message from someone I never wanted to hear from again, someone from my past, and the things they said, the things they implied, reminded me of why I built those walls in the first place." She clenched the handkerchief in her hand, her voice shaking uncontrollably now. "But today, when I saw you being your usual self, kind, patient, thoughtful, something inside me broke. Because I realized I've been lying to myself for years, and I couldn't keep pretending." Keanu's breath caught in his throat, not from shock, but from the realization that Sandra's emotional burden was far heavier than he had imagined, and he reached out slowly, gently placing his hand over hers, applying the softest pressure, grounding her in the moment. She didn't pull away. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to feel the comfort he offered without resistance. Keanu spoke quietly. "You're not alone. Whatever message you got, whatever pain resurfaced. You don't have to face it by yourself, not anymore." Sandra's lips trembled before she whispered, "I'm scared that if I tell you everything, you'll regret knowing." He shook his head immediately, his thumb brushing softly against the back of her hand. "I could never regret knowing your truth, Sandy. What hurts you matters to me." She took another shaky breath, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next, the part of the truth that went deeper than her past, deeper than her fear, deeper than her emotional walls. With a voice trembling like a loose thread about to snap, she whispered, "The truth I hid isn't just about my past or my fear. It's about you. It's about how deeply you've been part of my life without even knowing it. And I don't know how to say this without changing everything between us." Keanu's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a quiet, profound anticipation, because Sandra was finally opening the door she had kept locked for nearly 3 decades. And he knew, when she spoke the next words, nothing between them would ever be the same again. The night she finally let the truth escape. Sandra's hands trembled slightly against Keanu's as the weight of the moment gathered around them like a storm waiting for its first thunder. And though she kept her gaze lowered, unable to look him in the eyes, she felt the warmth of his presence anchoring her in a way she had not allowed herself to feel for years. And the realization that she had reached a point where silence was no longer survivable made her chest rise and fall unevenly, as if each breath carried a decade of fears she had tried to bury beneath her laughter and professionalism and the quiet resilience that she had become known for. She closed her eyes, gathering whatever courage still remained within her, and in that suspended silence, one so fragile that it felt like the slightest movement could shatter her composure, she finally whispered, "Keanu, you've been the constant in my life even when I didn't deserve any constants at all." And those words alone seemed to echo inside her, reminding her of the years she spent pushing away every source of comfort because she believed that attachment was dangerous and vulnerability was a weakness, and she had allowed herself to live in that emotional armor for so long that taking it off now felt almost impossible. Yet here she was, trembling, shaking, breaking in front of the one person she hoped would never see her in this state. Keanu's expression softened even further, his body angled toward her with quiet patience, and he said nothing because he understood instinctively that this moment needed silence. Not questions, not pressure, just presence. And Sandra took another unsteady breath before continuing. "There were times over the years when I thought about telling you everything. Times when I wanted to be honest, when I wanted to let you in, when I felt like I was drowning in my own fears, and you were the only person who could make me feel grounded again. But every time I got close to saying something, the fear took over." She paused, her lips trembling as she swallowed. "And I pulled back, because losing you would have broken me in a way I'm not sure I could have recovered from." She let out a shaky exhale, her voice crackling with emotion as she added, "And today, when I got that message, everything inside me collapsed. Every wall I built, every defense I created, it all fell apart because all I could think about was you, and how much of my life has been shaped by a truth I didn't have the courage to speak." Keanu remained silent, but his eyes were full of something deep, concern, compassion, and a quiet sadness that came from realizing the depth of her struggle. And Sandra took a moment before she lifted her eyes for the first time, meeting his gaze, and in that moment he saw everything she had tried to hide. The pain, the fear, the longing, the guilt, the emotional exhaustion of carrying a truth alone for far too long. "Keanu," she whispered, unable to stop the trembling in her voice, "I never meant to shut you out. I never meant to keep you at a distance. But every time I let myself imagine a future where I was honest with you, I panicked because honesty meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk, and I wasn't brave enough to take that risk." She laughed weakly through her tears, a sound filled with irony and sorrow. "I have spent years pretending I'm stronger than I am, pretending I don't need anyone, pretending I can handle everything alone. But the truth is I can't. Not when it comes to you." Keanu finally spoke, his voice a soft murmur against the stillness of the night. "Sandy, Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you think will change between us, you don't have to face it alone." Sandra closed her eyes tightly, pressing her trembling fingers over her mouth as though holding back the truth for one final second. And then, with a breath that felt heavier than anything she had breathed before, she whispered, "The truth I hid all these years is that you were the closest thing to love I ever allowed myself to feel." Keanu inhaled sharply, not in shock, not in discomfort, but in the quiet, stunned realization that the unspoken bond between them had been deeper than either of them had acknowledged. And Sandra continued before he could respond, her words spilling out as if they were pulled from her by some force she could no longer resist. "But it wasn't just love, it was fear too, because I didn't trust myself to love someone properly after what I went through. I didn't trust myself not to get hurt again. And most of all, I didn't trust that I was enough for someone like you." She laughed bitterly at herself, wiping her tears. "You were steady, calm, gentle, grounded, everything I wished I could be, and standing next to you I always felt like I wasn't enough. So I convinced myself that burying my feelings was the only way to protect both of us." Keanu reached out slowly, gently tilting her chin so she couldn't look away, and his voice held a softness that melted into the air around them. "Sandy, look at me." She did, reluctantly, her lashes still wet with tears, and Keanu continued, "You've always been enough, more than enough. You being human doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. And everything you just said, it doesn't change how I see you, not even a little." Sandra's lips quivered as she whispered, "I didn't want you to carry my fears. I didn't want to put my emotional mess on your shoulders. You've lived through so much already, Keanu, so much pain, so much loss, and I couldn't be another burden in your life." Keanu's expression softened into something almost heartbreaking. "Sandy," he murmured, "caring about someone isn't a burden. Letting someone care about you isn't a burden. And you have been one of the strengths in my life, not a weight." She shook her head, her voice frail. "Then why did it hurt so much to think about being honest with you? Why did the idea of telling you everything make me feel like I was walking toward heartbreak?" Keanu took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully, because when someone means a lot to you, you fear losing them, and the more they mean to you, the scarier the truth becomes. Sandra looked down again, her hands gripping the fabric of the handkerchief. "And I felt it every time we were together. Every time I saw you smile, every time you stood beside me at events, every time you defended me publicly even when I didn't know you had done it, every time you supported my choices quietly without making a big deal out of it. I felt everything, and I tried to bury everything." Keanu's eyes softened even more. "What did the message say, Sandy?" She inhaled deeply, her voice shaking with the fear of reliving the moment. "It was from someone who once promised to protect my heart and then broke it without hesitation. They reached out today saying they had been watching me, saying they knew I wasn't truly happy, saying they knew I still didn't trust anyone fully, and then they mentioned you." Keanu tensed slightly. "Me?" She nodded. "They said the world sees what I try to hide. That people see how I look at you, how I trust you, how different I am around you, and that sooner or later you'd realize it too and walk away." Keanu's jaw tightened, not in anger at Sandra, but in anger toward the person who had hurt her so deeply that even years later they held the power to shake her entire foundation. "They don't know me," he said firmly. Sandra wiped her tears again, though they kept falling. I know they don't know you, but hearing those words broke something open inside me, because everything they said was everything I've been afraid of for so long, that if you ever saw the parts of me I've kept hidden, you'd slowly drift away." Keanu shook his head gently, leaning closer. "I've been here for 30 years, Sandy, 30 years, and I'm here now. You're not losing me." Sandra covered her mouth as a sob escaped her, not dramatic, but soft, pained, full of years of fear cracking open. Keanu gently placed his hand on her back, his touch grounding steady. She leaned into him slightly, not fully, but enough to let him know that the walls she had built for so long were beginning to crumble, not because she was weak, but because she was finally safe enough to let them fall. After several long moments, she whispered, "There's more, and this is the part that scares me the most." Keanu nodded, reassuring her with nothing more than the quiet strength of his presence. "Tell me." She inhaled shakily, looking up with tear-filled eyes, and whispered, "The truth I hid for years isn't just that I cared about you, or that I needed you, or that I depended on you emotionally. The truth is, you were the one person I wanted to build a life with, and I spent years pretending that wasn't true." Keanu's breath hitched, the impact of her words settling heavily between them, and before he could respond, Sandra added in a trembling whisper that held the power to reshape everything between them. "And I thought, if you ever found out, you'd run." The truth that shook Keanu to his core. Keanu felt something shift inside him the moment Sandra's trembling confession settled between them. Like the entire night air had thickened with a truth that neither of them could outrun anymore. and though her voice had been barely above a whisper, the impact of her words echoed louder than anything he had heard from her in the decades they had known each other, and he found himself staring at her, not with shock or disbelief, but with a depth of emotion he had kept buried beneath layers of restraint and quiet admiration for years. Because hearing her admit that she had wanted a life with him, a future with him, something beyond the red carpets and movie sets and friendly banter, made every moment they had shared over the years suddenly sharpen in clarity, as if all the subtle glances, all the unspoken warmth, all the silent moments of understanding had been woven together by something deeper than either of them had dared name. Sandra lowered her eyes again, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap as if she expected rejection, distance, or a polite decline, and her voice cracked when she whispered, "I know how this sounds. I know how heavy it is to hear. And I'm not saying this to make anything complicated for you. I'm saying it because I can't carry it anymore." She inhaled sharply, pressing her palm against her chest as if steadying herself, and continued, "For years, I convinced myself that being honest with you would ruin everything, that you'd pull away, or feel sorry for me, or shut down emotionally because you've always been private, careful, gentle with people's feelings. I didn't want to be the reason you felt pressured or overwhelmed." Keanu didn't speak immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, drawing a slow breath as he processed the depth of her vulnerability, and then he moved closer again, closer than he had been all evening, his presence warm, steady, grounding. "Sandy," he said softly, his voice carrying a tenderness that made her lift her eyes in reflex, "you never would have ruined anything. You couldn't ruin something that was built on years of trust and kindness." She studied his face cautiously, searching for signs of discomfort, but instead found a softness in his expression that seemed to unravel her fears one thread at a time. And he continued, "You think I would have run from you, but you never realized how much I stayed because of you." She blinked in confusion, unable to understand the meaning behind his words, and Keanu exhaled slowly, revealing a truth he had locked inside himself for as long as she had hidden hers. "You were not the only one who felt something," he admitted, the honesty in his tone cutting through the years of unspoken tension between them. "There were moments, so many moments, when I wondered what would happen if I said something, if I let myself hope, if I let myself imagine something more between us." Sandra froze, unable to comprehend what she was hearing, her breath catching painfully in her chest as Keanu continued. "But just like you, I held back. I held back because you were healing from things you never voiced, and I didn't want to add pressure to your life. I held back because you had your walls, and I didn't want to push against them. I held back because I thought, if I said something at the wrong time, I'd hurt you instead of helping you." Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening with disbelief and dawning realization, and she whispered, "You felt something too." Keanu nodded, his gaze unflinchingly sincere. "Of course I did. I'm human, Sandy. I'm not immune to your kindness, your strength, your humor, your presence. You think I never noticed the way my world felt calmer around you, the way conversations made sense with you even when everything else felt chaotic. You think I didn't feel it when you walked into a room and the energy shifted, quietly, naturally, beautifully." Sandra's breath trembled, her body absorbing every word with the shock of a truth she never dared imagine, and she felt the weight of years, decades, lift slightly from her shoulders. But then her expression softened into something wounded yet yearning. "If you felt something too, why didn't you say anything?" Keanu sighed deeply, leaning his elbows on his knees as he searched for the right words. "Because I knew you were fragile beneath the strength you showed the world. I knew you carried wounds you didn't talk about. I knew you'd been hurt by people who didn't deserve even a second of your trust. And I never wanted you to think my presence in your life came with a price or expectation." He paused, his voice gentler now. "And I didn't want to risk losing you either. Our friendship is, one of the rare things in this industry that has remained pure, honest, uncomplicated, and deeply grounding. I didn't want to make a confession that would put strain on something that already meant more to me than most people realized." Sandra felt tears gather again, not from pain this time, but from the overwhelming mixture of relief, regret, and love that suddenly made her chest ache in a different way. "So we've both been hiding," she whispered. "All these years?" Keanu nodded. "Yes, and maybe we both believed we were protecting something when in reality we were both running from the same fear." She pressed the handkerchief against her face again, taking slow breaths to steady herself, and after a few moments she whispered, "But today, when I got that message, it broke me open. I realized I've spent more time fearing the loss of something that never even had a chance to exist than allowing myself to believe it was possible." Her voice wavered. "And that scared me even more." Keanu gently touched her shoulder, a careful gesture full of care. "Sandy," he murmured. You don't have to fear what you haven't lost. She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears and vulnerability. But do you understand what I'm saying? She whispered. I didn't hide my feelings because I doubted you. I hid them because I doubted myself. I thought if someone ever saw the real me, the wounded, fearful, imperfect parts, they'd think twice about staying. And I couldn't bear the thought of you looking at me differently. Keanu took her hand slowly, intertwining his fingers with hers, and the warmth of his touch made her inhale sharply. Sandy, you've always been real with me, even when you tried to hide things, even when you were quiet, even when you laughed through pain. And not once, have I ever looked at you and seen someone unworthy. Her lips parted as if to speak, but instead she just stared at him, absorbing the sincerity in his voice. Keanu continued, maybe we both let fear guide us for too long. Maybe we both underestimated what the other person felt. Maybe we both needed time to grow, heal, and understand what we truly wanted. But what matters is this moment, right now. You told me the truth you've been hiding, and I'm still here. I'm not running. Sandra trembled, her emotions crashing against one another like waves against rock. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, letting the weight of honesty settle between them. Heavy, raw, liberating. Eventually Sandra whispered, I'm scared of what comes next. Keanu squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll figure it out together, one step at a time, no pressure, no expectations, just honesty. She nodded slowly, her breathing steadier now, though tears still clung to her lashes. I don't know how to be fully open, she confessed. I've spent so many years hiding behind laughter and strength that I don't know how to share the parts I always kept buried. Keanu smiled gently, a soft, warm smile that made her chest tighten with something tender. Then start small, he said. Start with the truth you've already shared. Let it be enough for tonight. Let yourself breathe without fear. Sandra inhaled deeply, closing her eyes as she leaned slightly into the comfort of his presence. Not collapsing, not depending entirely, but allowing herself for the first time to rest emotionally without apologizing for it. Keanu kept his hand over hers, steady and warm, and after a long stretch of quiet, she whispered, Do you think, after all these years, there's still something left to explore between us? Keanu looked at her with an expression that held the weight of years of silent affection. I think, he whispered, that nothing between us is gone, nothing was ever gone, it was only waiting. Sandra's heart clenched at his words, and she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding for years. Then what happens now? She whispered. Keanu turned slightly toward her, his voice low and full of meaning. Now you tell me the rest of the truth, the part you still haven't said. Sandra's eyes widened slightly, fear flickering through them again. Keanu, he shook his head gently. Not everything at once, just the part that's still hurting you right now. Sandra swallowed hard, her voice barely audible when she whispered, The message wasn't just a reminder of my past, it was a threat. Keanu's expression shifted instantly, his warmth replaced by protectiveness, but he controlled his reaction, staying calm for her sake. Sandy, what kind of threat? She trembled, her next words cracking in the night air like ice breaking. They said they would expose something I've kept hidden for years, something I never told anyone, not even you. Keanu leaned in, eyes steady, voice soft but firm. Then tell me before they do, whatever it is, I'm here, and we'll face it together. Sandra looked at him, tears forming once more, because the truth she had been hiding wasn't just about feelings or fears or emotional wounds. It was something far heavier, far more dangerous, and she wasn't sure if speaking it aloud would set her free or destroy everything she had left. The secret that could break her or finally set her free. The air around them felt heavier now, not in a suffocating way, but in a way that mirrored the gravity of Sandra's confession. And Keanu leaned just a little closer, because he could sense that whatever she was about to reveal carried the kind of emotional weight that a person hides only when they've spent years learning to survive rather than simply live. And Sandra's hands trembled in her lap. The handkerchief crushed between her fingers as though she was gripping not a piece of fabric, but the last fragment of courage she had left inside her. She inhaled sharply, her voice cracking before she even spoke, and she said, Keanu, I didn't just hide feelings for you, I hid a part of my life that I was terrified would hurt my career, hurt my reputation, hurt everything I worked for, and most of all, hurt you if it ever reached you through someone else. And Keanu felt his breath still in his chest, his focus sharpening instinctively, every part of him tuned to her trembling voice as she continued. Years ago, before everything settled in my life, before the films, before the public saw me as someone strong and composed, I made a mistake. A big one that has followed me silently even when I tried to outrun it. She swallowed hard, her voice so small it nearly disappeared into the quiet night. And the person who messaged me today, they weren't reaching out to reconnect. They were reaching out to remind me that they still have power over that part of my life. They've been waiting to use it, waiting for the right moment. Keanu's voice came out low and steady, a controlled whisper of calm that wrapped around her like reassurance. Sandy, whatever happened, whatever they're holding over you, you don't have to face it alone. She shook her head, wiping her tears, her breath uneven. You don't understand, she whispered. This isn't something I can just confess to the world. It's not a scandal. It's not something tabloid-worthy. It's personal, deeply personal, and if it ever became public, it would twist everything I am, everything I've fought for, everything people admire about me. Her voice trembled again. And it would drag you into the mess too. That's what terrifies me most. Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze locked on her with silent intensity and compassion. Tell me, he said softly. Whatever it is, I won't judge you. I won't leave. I won't let anyone use your past against you. Sandra stared at him through tear-filled eyes, and for a moment she couldn't speak because the fear inside her had been buried for so long it felt almost alive, a creature clawing at her ribs every time she tried to breathe freely. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and when she opened them again, the truth slipped out in a broken whisper. Before I became the version of myself that the world sees, I was struggling. Emotionally, mentally, financially. I made choices I'm not proud of. I trusted the wrong people. I was manipulated by someone who pretended to care about me. And one night, one moment of weakness became something I spent years regretting. Keanu remained silent, allowing her to speak without interruption, and Sandra's voice trembled harder as she said, I signed something I didn't understand at the time. A contract, a binding agreement, something that gave someone too much access to my life, too much control. I thought it was just a partnership deal, something harmless. But it was a trap. She swallowed a shaky breath, gripping the handkerchief tighter. And when I tried to break free of it, when I tried to cut ties, they told me they'd expose what I had confessed in vulnerable moments. The fears, the insecurities, the things I never admitted publicly. And worse, they said they'd twist it, make it look like I was unstable, like I was reckless, like I couldn't be trusted. Keanu's jaw tightened, but he remained calm for her sake. Sandra, he whispered, you were young, you were manipulated. That's not a crime. She nodded weakly, tears falling. Maybe not legally, but emotionally, it left scars I never spoke about, scars that influenced every relationship I had afterward, scars that made me terrified to let anyone in, especially you. Keanu reached out, placing his hand gently over hers again, grounding her, and she didn't pull away this time. What happened after you tried to leave? He asked softly. Sandra looked down, her voice cracking. They threatened to leak messages where I expressed my fears, my insecurities, my doubts about myself. They said they'd expose a version of me the world has never seen, the broken version, the one I've spent years healing. Her breath wavered. And they said, if I ever got close to anyone in a way that threatened them, they'd release everything. Keanu frowned slightly. Threaten them? How? Sandra pressed her trembling lips together before whispering, because they had feelings for me, possessive ones, obsessive ones. And every time I moved on, every time I started healing, every time I started getting close to someone, especially you, they noticed. And they found ways to remind me they still had control. She shook her head miserably. You don't know what it did to me, Keanu. Every time we were together, even just as friends, I kept thinking about that threat. Thinking that if I let myself want something more with you, I'd drag you into something ugly. I'd hurt your reputation. I'd bring chaos into your life. And I couldn't do that to you. Keanu inhaled deeply, quietly, his expression filled with a mixture of empathy and restrained anger, not at her, but at the person who had held her hostage emotionally for so long. Sandy, he said gently, you should have told me. She shook her head again, tears sliding down her cheeks. I was ashamed of the mistake, ashamed of being manipulated, ashamed of being vulnerable enough to fall into it. She exhaled shakily. And I was terrified you'd see me differently. You've always been so grounded, so centered, so careful with who you trust. I didn't want you to look at me and think I was reckless or naive. Keanu moved closer, his voice firmer now though still gentle. Sandra, listen to me. Being manipulated isn't recklessness. Being used in a vulnerable moment isn't naivety. It's something that happens to the best people, the kindest people, because they trust with their hearts. Sandra bit her lip hard as another tear fell. And now, today, they told me they still have everything, and they threatened that if I let anyone close, emotionally, they'd release the entire archive. And you, her voice cracked painfully, you were the first name they mentioned. Keanu froze for a heartbeat, absorbing the weight of that realization, and something protective and fierce rose inside him, not out of anger, but out of the instinct to shield someone he had cared about for years. So they're watching you, he murmured. Sandra nodded. Yes, They follow me online, track public appearances, look for signs that I'm happy again, and when they saw us together during interviews or events, they used it. They said the world already suspects there's something between us, and if I ever confirmed it or even hinted at it, they would destroy both our reputations. Keanu's voice dropped to a low, steady whisper. They can't destroy us with your past. They can't destroy you with something that happened when you were hurting and alone, and they definitely can't destroy me with lies. Sandra covered her eyes, overwhelmed. But I believed they could for years. She lowered her hands, revealing tear-stained cheeks. That's why I never let myself think about you in the way my heart wanted to. That's why I distanced myself every time things felt too real. That's why I convinced myself it was safer to keep you at arm's length. She inhaled slowly, painfully. I was protecting you. Keanu shook his head slightly, his expression tender and unwavering. Sandy, I never needed protection from loving someone. Her breath hitched violently, the depth of his words striking her like an emotional blow. Keanu, what are you saying? She whispered. He didn't hesitate. This time he didn't hide behind restraint or caution. I'm saying that for years I've cared about you in ways I couldn't admit. I'm saying that I would have stood by you then and I'll stand by you now. I'm saying that your past doesn't scare me away. And I'm saying that whoever tried to control you doesn't get to control your future anymore. Sandra's tears fell in a heavier stream now, not just from pain, but from an overwhelming mix of relief, love, and disbelief. But what if they release everything? She whispered. What if the world sees the parts of me I tried to heal? What if they twist the truth? Keanu squeezed her hand gently, lifting her gaze back to his. Then we deal with it together, with honesty and dignity. The world can't hurt you with truths you're no longer afraid of. And they can't hurt me with anything about you, because nothing about you would ever make me walk away. Sandra stared at him, breath trembling, heart pounding, the weight of her secret no longer crushing her because for the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a celebrity, not as the strong woman the world expected her to be, but as a human being with fears, scars, and vulnerabilities. And when Keanu brushed his thumb softly over her knuckles, grounding her once more, she whispered in a voice full of fragile hope, "There's still one last part of the truth, the part I've been too afraid to say. And if I say it, there's no going back." Keanu leaned closer, his voice softer than the night breeze but stronger than any fear inside her. "Then say it, Sandy. Whatever it is, I'm ready." Sandra swallowed hard, tears trembling on her lashes, her entire body taut with the weight of the final truth she had guarded for years. A truth that could change everything between them forever. And in a fragile whisper that seemed to crack the night open, she began to speak. The final truth that changed everything forever. Sandra's breath trembled in her chest as if her ribs were struggling to hold her together while every fear she had spent years burying clawed its way back to the surface. Her hands tightening around Keanu. As though gripping him was the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. And Keanu, steady and patient, waited for her to find the courage she needed. His presence wrapped around her like a warm, calming force that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. No matter how terrifying the truth felt in her throat, she inhaled slowly, shakily, wiping her tears with the back of her trembling hand before she whispered, "The last part of the truth, the part I've never told anyone, not a single soul, is that everything I feared losing wasn't just my reputation, my image, or my career, it was you, Keanu. You were the one thing I couldn't risk, the one person I couldn't afford to lose, the one presence in my life that felt too precious to gamble with, and the reason I kept pushing you away wasn't because I didn't love you, it was because I loved you too much." And with those words, something inside her broke open fully, not in a destructive way, but in a freeing way, like a window finally cracking after years of too much pressure, allowing the air to rush through and carry away the ghosts she'd been fighting alone. Her tears streamed down her cheeks as she continued, her voice trembling with decades of suppressed emotion. "I loved you quietly in silence in the spaces between our conversations, in the moments the world didn't see, in the laughter you always brought out of me so effortlessly, and the reason I stayed away wasn't fear of myself, it was fear of hurting you. Fear of dragging you into my mistakes. Fear of making your life harder. Fear of being the reason you faced chaos or pain." Keanu inhaled deeply, his eyes soft and full of a quiet intensity that made her breath catch, his thumb brushing gently across the back of her hand as he whispered, "Sandy, you were never a danger to me. You were never something to avoid, and you loving me even silently was never something I would have feared." But she shook her head, wiping her tears again as she tried to steady her voice. "You don't understand," she whispered. I watched you. I watched how you handled loss. I watched how careful you were with the people you loved. I watched how deeply you felt everything, even when you didn't express it. And the idea of adding my chaos, my past, my mistakes, my emotional baggage to your life felt selfish. I didn't want to be another weight on your shoulders, so I chose distance. I chose silence. I chose to protect you even if it meant breaking my own heart a little more each year. Her confession pierced the night air, and Keanu felt his chest tighten in ways he hadn't expected, not from pain, but from the depth of what she had kept hidden: love, fear, guilt, devotion, all tangled in a silence she thought would protect him. He leaned closer, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Sandy, every moment you tried to protect me, you were breaking yourself. You shouldn't have done that alone." And she let out a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head at her own irony. "I didn't know how to do anything else," she admitted. "I've been strong for so long that I forgot how to ask for strength from someone else. And every time you came close to my heart, I panicked because you were the one person I wanted to be fully honest with. The one person who deserved to see every side of me. And I wasn't ready to let someone see the wounded parts, not when it was you." Keanu's eyes softened even further, and he lifted a hand slowly, carefully, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wasn't ready, but she didn't. She stayed still, breath trembling as he gently cupped the side of her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "Sandy," he whispered, "I've seen your strength. I've seen your vulnerability even when you tried to hide it. I've seen your kindness, your courage, your fear, your resilience. And not once have I thought you were anything less than remarkable. Not once did I think you were too much. Not once did I think you were someone I needed distance from." Sandra's eyes closed as new tears fell, her voice cracking as she whispered, "But I pushed you away." Keanu shook his head softly. "And I stayed every time." She let out a shaky laugh that quickly dissolved into a sob. Why did you stay even when I was cold, even when I withdrew, even when I avoided you?" Keanu took a slow breath, his voice trembling slightly with honesty. "Because I cared about you too. Because watching you struggle alone broke my heart. Because I knew there was something inside you couldn't speak. Because I felt something for you that I didn't want to lose either." She froze, staring at him through tear-filled eyes, her breath catching painfully as she asked, "Keanu, what are you saying?" And without hesitation this time, without fear, without restraint, Keanu leaned closer, his forehead touching hers gently as he whispered, "I'm saying that I loved you too. Maybe not the way the world romanticizes love, but in the way that mattered, in the quiet way, in the respectful way, in the patient way, in the way that meant I was willing to wait as long as you needed. In the way that meant I cared about your happiness more than I cared about confessing what I felt." Sandra's breath broke into tiny pieces as she whispered, "You loved me." Keanu nodded, their foreheads still touching. "I still do, Sandy. I never stopped caring, not in 30 years, not once." She covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed, sobbing softly as the weight of decades finally lifted, her heart cracking open in the most vulnerable, human way, and Keanu gently held her shoulders to steady her as she cried. "I spent all these years afraid," she whispered through her tears. "Afraid of losing you, afraid of disappointing you, afraid of ruining something beautiful. I thought silence was safer." Keanu shook his head. "Silence protected neither of us, it only kept us apart." She nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks. "I know, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry for every year I stayed distant, for every time I pretended I didn't care, for every moment I pushed you away when all I wanted was to move closer." Keanu's voice softened into something tender and warm. "You don't have to apologize for protecting yourself. You survived something painful. You did what you thought you needed to do, and I'm here now. That's what matters." She looked at him for a long moment, a raw, emotional gaze filled with everything she hadn't said for years, and she whispered, "So what now? What happens to us now?" Keanu took her hands gently in his, grounding her once again. "Now we stop running, we stop hiding, we stop assuming the worst. Now we rebuild, slowly, honestly, with care," and then he added softly, "and with choice, not fear." Sandra swallowed hard, her voice nearly breaking again. "You want this? After everything I told you? After everything I hid?" Keanu nodded without hesitation. "I want this because of everything you told me, because you trusted me, because you let yourself finally be honest, because you let me see the parts of you you were afraid to show the world, and because everything you confessed only made me respect you more." She let out a long, trembling breath, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, safety, relief, hope, and she whispered, "I don't know how to move forward without fear." Keanu squeezed her hands gently, offering her the kind of reassurance she had run from all her life. "Then we move forward with fear, together. Fear doesn't go away overnight, but it becomes smaller when you don't carry it alone." Sandra nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks again, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release, of relief, of finally letting go of the emotional armor she had spent decades wearing. She leaned into him, her head resting gently against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel held, not as a burden, not as someone broken, not as someone hiding secrets, but as herself. Keanu wrapped an arm around her quietly, his presence warm and steady, letting her breathe, letting her exist, letting her feel without judgment. They sat like that for a long time, two souls who had spent decades dancing around the truth, finally finding a space where silence wasn't protection but peace. Eventually, Sandra whispered into the quiet air, "Thank you for staying." Keanu pressed a gentle kiss to the side of her forehead, a gesture soft, respectful, full of decades of unspoken tenderness, and replied, "I was always going to stay." And somewhere between the fading night and the quiet glow of dawn, the weight she carried for years dissolved into something softer, something lighter, something new, because the truth she hid for years didn't destroy them. It finally brought them home,